They say the cruelest thieves don't come in the night. They don't break your windows. They don't slip through the door with a crowbar. No, the cruelest thieves come smiling, holding your hand, calling you mother. My name doesn't matter anymore. I am 68 years old, and I've already been erased once, erased by the boy I carried in my belly, the boy whose first cry broke me open and made me believe love was stronger than pain. My son, my only son, he didn't just steal my house, he stole my dignity. And that was the day I learned how far a mother can fall before she finally stops calling it love. It began quietly. Most betrayals do. There was no explosion, no fight that cracked the walls, just a suggestion over tea. Mom, this house is too much for you. You shouldn't be worrying about the roof or the taxes or the bills. Let me take care of it. I remember I smiled, relieved, because I was tired, so tired of patching leaks, of juggling envelopes stamped with red letters, of listening to the house groan like an old man with every storm. My body ached. My knees screamed when I bent to scrub. And here was my son, my baby, grown tall and confident, promising to carry the weight I had carried alone for decades. He slid the papers across the table. Just signatures, just a precaution, he said. I'll handle everything. You can just live here, free of worry. And I believed him, because isn't that what mothers do? Believe? My hand trembled as I signed, not from fear, but from hope. Foolish hope that maybe, after all the nights I had held him through fevers, after all the dinners I had gone without, so his plate stayed full, after all the blows I had taken from his father, so his small body never knew the taste of fists, maybe this was the moment when the circle closed, when he became my shelter. But circles don't always close. Sometimes they strangle. The day the letter came, thick and official with its seal pressed deep into the envelope, I thought it was a mistake. A notice from the bank saying my mortgage was cleared, a formality. But as I unfolded the pages, black ink bleeding against white, the words crushed me. Eviction, effective immediately. The property is no longer yours. My son's name was there, bold, clean, owning what had been my life's work. I stumbled outside, clutching the letter, and I saw him standing by the gate, not a boy anymore, a man in a crisp shirt, his face carved sharp, his eyes unreadable. He didn't even flinch as I screamed his name. Tell me, this isn't true. But his lips curled into something colder than a stranger's silence. Mom, it's better this way. You'll understand eventually. Better for him, better for his bank account, better for his pride. Not for me, never for me. Do you know what it feels like to have your memories sold out from under you? To watch the walls that carried your laughter, your grief, your survival stripped from your hands as though you were nothing more than a squatter? I built that house with scraps. I painted its walls after midnight, rocking him in a cradle between brush strokes. I kept its heat alive by burning furniture when his father drank away the coal money. I filled its kitchen with smells of bread and garlic and soup stretched thin with water, because love can make even thin soup taste rich. That house was mine, my proof that I had endured, and with a pen stroke, my son took it. That night, I sat on the porch until the stars blurred into tears. I thought of walking away quietly, vanishing like an old widow into the wind. I thought of swallowing the shame, calling it fate. But as the hours passed, shame hardened into something sharper. He had taken my house, but he would not take me, and that was the night I vowed. If he wanted me buried, I would rise screaming. If he wanted me broken, I would show him the strength he had never imagined lived in my bones. This is not a story about losing everything. This is a story about the fire that begins in the ashes. They gave me a deadline, 2 weeks to leave the only home I had ever truly owned, 2 weeks to pack up decades of my life into boxes that suddenly felt too small to hold everything I had endured. I moved like a ghost through those rooms. Every corner held a memory sharp enough to cut. The dent in the wall where my husband once threw a bottle, and I shielded my boy with my body. The faded marks on the doorframe where I'd measured his height each year. Pencil scratches climbing higher, higher, while I whispered prayers he'd grow into a better man than his father. The patch of kitchen tile I had replaced myself on my knees, hands raw, because we couldn't afford repairs, and I refused to let my child live in a house with holes in the floor. I whispered to those walls as I packed, "You kept us safe. You held us when no one else would." But houses don't answer back. He didn't help me pack, my son, my flesh. He didn't even visit. He sent his wife once, standing in the doorway with her manicured nails and a pitying smile that cut deeper than any insult. "You'll be happier in a smaller place," she said. "Less to clean, less to worry about." I wanted to scream, to ask her if she had ever scrubbed blood off the floorboards, if she had ever burned her own wedding veil, just to keep the fire alive for her baby. But I stayed silent, because my words would mean nothing to her. She had her world, polished and neat. I was just an inconvenience. When the last box was sealed, I sat in the living room one final time. The room smelled of dust and lemon cleaner, but if I closed my eyes, I could still smell Sunday bread, still hear his small feet running down the hall, still feel the weight of him asleep against my chest. I left the key on the counter. My hands shook so badly I could barely set it down. And then I walked out. Do you know what it feels like to step onto the street and realize you have no place to return to carry your whole life in cardboard and plastic bags, while the house you bled for belongs to someone who once cried your name for comfort? That was the first time I understood what betrayal tastes like. It's not fire, it's ash, dry, choking, endless. I found a room above the laundromat. One window cracked, one bed thin and stiff. The hum of the machines below was constant, vibrating through the floor, shaking my bones at night. I couldn't afford better, not with the scraps I had left. My pension barely stretched, and the money I thought I could rely on was gone. The house had been my only anchor. The first nights I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the glow of street lights, listening to strangers' voices drift up from the alley. I thought of all the women I'd known who simply gave up when they were left with nothing, who let the silence swallow them, who died quietly, forgotten, and I almost envied them. But then came the rage. It didn't roar, it whispered. It pressed against my ribs like a secret wanting out. He took your house, don't let him take your soul. I started walking. Long walks, hours at a time, through streets that didn't belong to me, past shop windows that reflected a woman I barely recognized, hair graying, face lined, shoulders bent from carrying too much for too long. But in those walks, I found something I hadn't felt in years, space to breathe. And one evening, I stumbled into the library. The place smelled of dust and ink, like old secrets. I wandered between the shelves until I found a quiet corner. And there, taped to the wall, was a flyer, a small notice, hand-drawn roses framing the words, Women's Circle, Thursdays, 7 p.m. A place for those who have lost, endured, or survived. I stood there a long time, staring at the paper. My hands trembled as if the letters themselves had weight, lost, endured, survived. That was me. I didn't go that Thursday, or the next. Pride is a stubborn jailer. But on the third week, when the machines below my room rattled louder than my thoughts, when the silence inside me grew too heavy to carry, I walked back to the library. The circle was small. A handful of women, most with gray hair like mine, their eyes lined not just with age, but with history. They welcomed me with nods, with soft smiles that held no pity, only recognition. I sat down, my throat dry, my heart hammering. I didn't speak that night, I just listened. One woman told of a husband who locked her in the basement for years. Another spoke of children who never called, who treated her as though she had died long ago. Their voices were jagged but steady. Their stories were wounds, but also proof. And for the first time since losing my home, I felt less alone. I wasn't ready to tell my story yet, not then. But the rage inside me began to shift, to sharpen, to take shape. My son had taken my house, but he hadn't buried me yet, and he was about to learn that the woman he thought was broken still had fire left in her bones. The first night I spoke in the circle, my hands shook so badly I thought the chair might collapse beneath me. It was Margaret, sharp-eyed, tall, with a scarf tied tight around her throat, who turned to me and said, "You've been quiet long enough. Your silence is too heavy. Let it out." And so I did. I told them about my son, about the papers he slid across the table, about the way I signed without reading, because I believed in him more than I believed in myself, about the letter that stole my house, about standing in a doorway I had scrubbed for 40 years, key trembling in my hand, forced to leave as though I were a trespasser in my own life. The words came jagged, raw, tumbling out like broken glass. And when I finished, the room was silent, but not the silence of judgment, the silence of listening. Margaret reached across the circle, her hand rough but steady, and squeezed mine. "You survived worse," she said, and I realized she was right. I had survived fists that cracked ribs, nights without food, winters when I burned furniture just to keep my son alive. Losing a house was not the end of me. It was the beginning of something else. The circle became my anchor. Every Thursday, I walked to the library. At first I still trembled, afraid my words were too ugly to share. But as the weeks passed, I began to breathe easier. I laughed at small jokes. I cried when I didn't mean to. I found myself not just speaking, but listening, really listening to the women around me. There was Ruth, soft-spoken, who raised 6 children only to watch them scatter like dust in the wind. There was June, whose son was in prison, whose daughter pretended she was already dead. Each story cut me, but each story stitched me too. And slowly, I remembered something I had buried long ago. One evening, Margaret pressed something into my hand, a brush, its bristles frayed, its handle smooth from use. "Bring something of yourself next week," she said, her eyes daring me to refuse. I didn't understand at first, but that night, back in my little room above the laundromat, I dug through the boxes I had carried from the house. Beneath linens that still smelled faintly of lemon soap, beneath photographs yellowed with time, I found a tin box. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were old paints, cracked with age, sketchbooks filled with drawings I had made when I was a girl, roses, storms, women with burning eyes. Before the bruises, before the betrayals, before the silence, I had been an artist. The memory hit me so hard I couldn't breathe. I saw myself at 17, sitting on the edge of a meadow, sketchbook in my lap, believing beauty was mine to capture. I remembered the thrill of color, the power of creation. But life had buried that girl. Survival had stolen her voice. That night, I sat at the little table by the cracked window. My hands trembled as I dipped a brush into paint, dragging it across paper. The lines were clumsy, the colors uneven. But with each stroke, something inside me cracked open. It wasn't just paint. It was defiance. It was proof. The next Thursday, I carried my painting to the circle. Roses breaking through stone. The women gasped, then smiled. Margaret touched my shoulder and whispered one word, "Beautiful." For the first time in decades, I believed her. I painted every night after that. My little room filled with canvases, roses, storms, women scarred but unbroken. Each stroke was a confession, a scream, a resurrection. Then came the invitation. The community center was hosting a small art show. They wanted local painters to display their work. Margaret pushed me, insisting I submit. "They need to see you," she said. "You've been invisible long enough." I laughed, shaking my head. Me, an old woman, forgotten by her own son, showing my work to strangers? But Margaret didn't flinch. "Do it," she said, "for yourself." So I did. The night of the exhibit, my roses hung on the walls under bright lights. Strangers stopped, tilted their heads, whispered to each other. One woman pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Beautiful." I stood there, trembling, but alive. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting for my son's approval. I wasn't begging for a seat at his table. I was claiming my own. But the dead don't rise without cost, and the moment I stepped into the light, my son saw me again. Not with love, not with pride, with fury. I thought the exhibit would pass quietly, just a handful of townspeople, a few kind words, and maybe even the relief of knowing I still had something to give. I thought my son would never know, or if he did, he would dismiss it as a silly pastime of a lonely old woman. I was wrong. The first sign came as a phone call. His name lit up my screen, and my heart stuttered. For one foolish moment, I thought he was calling to reconcile, to say he had seen my paintings and remembered the mother who once carried him through every storm, but his voice was ice. "Mom, I heard about your little art show." I smiled, nervous but hopeful. "Yes, it was wonderful. People seem to... Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me?" His tone cut sharper than a blade. "People are asking questions. They're saying I abandoned you. Do you know how that makes me look?" Humiliation. That was his concern, not my survival, not my pain. His image, his reputation. "Son," I whispered, my throat tight, "I wasn't trying to shame you. I just wanted something for myself." "For yourself," he spat. "That's the problem. You've always been selfish. Do you ever wonder why you're alone?" And then the line went dead. I sat there, the phone heavy in my hand. Selfish. For 60 years I had given myself away, my youth, my body, my health, my very soul, so that boy could rise. I had starved so he could eat. I had stood between him and his father's fists. I had buried my own dreams so his might breathe. And now the child I once rocked to sleep called me selfish for daring to exist without his permission. But his venom was only the beginning. 2 nights later, I heard pounding on my door. My heart jolted, old terror flooding back, the kind that used to strike when his father came home drunk. When I opened it, my son stood there, his eyes bloodshot, his breath sour with drink. Behind him, in the car, I saw shadows. His children, my grandchildren, their faces pale in the streetlight. "You ruined me," he shouted, jabbing a finger at my chest. Spit flew from his lips. "You tell strangers our business, and now they look at me like I'm trash, like I'm him." Him, his father, the man whose fists I had taken, so that this boy could grow without fear. "Please," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. "The children, don't you dare speak their names." His roar shook the walls. "You're nothing, not their grandmother, not anyone." The car horn blared, his wife urging him to stop. He staggered back, spat at my feet, and stumbled away into the night. I closed the door and locked it. My legs shook. My breath caught in my throat. But instead of collapsing, I picked up a rag and wiped his spit from the floor. Slowly, deliberately. That was the last time I opened the door for him. But he wasn't done. None of them were. A week later, another envelope slid beneath my door. Thick paper, bold type, my son's signature at the bottom. It read more like a contract than a letter. "You are forbidden from contacting us or our children. You are forbidden from discussing private family matters in public. If you continue, we will pursue legal action. Consider this your final warning." Legal action against me, the woman who bore him, the woman who bled for him, the woman who signed away her house because she believed he loved her. I laughed then, a bitter, broken laugh that scraped my throat raw. Then I carried the letter to the stove and burned it, watching the flames curl his threats into ash. He thought he could silence me, but every attempt only sharpened my voice. Because here's the truth. When someone pretends you are dead, They expect you to lie still in the grave. They don't expect you to claw at the dirt, to scream, to rise. And once you rise, they will do anything to shove you back under. But I had already been buried once, and I would not go back. The fair was supposed to be small, modest booths in the town square, laughter spilling through the air, the smell of fried dough and popcorn floating past. The community had asked if I would hang a few of my paintings in the town hall again. I almost said no. Fear still clung to me, fear of my son's fury, fear of his threats, fear of what he might do next. But Margaret pressed my hand in the circle, her red scarf blazing like a flame. "If you hide," she said, "you let him bury you twice." So I went. I hung my canvases with care, roses clawing through cracks, storms breaking into dawn, women scarred yet unbowed. Each painting was a confession, each brushstroke proof that I was still alive. For the first time in years, I felt steady. I stood in the town hall watching strangers tilt their heads, smile, whisper beautiful. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had won a piece of peace. And then I heard it. Mother. The word froze me. I turned, and there he was, my son, and not alone. He brought his siblings. They stood together like judges. Marcus in his suit, polished and cold. Clara, lips thin, her husband looming behind her. Henry, fists clenched, his children clinging to his coat. The room fell silent. Whispers spread like ripples in water. "What are you doing?" Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "Parading our misery for strangers? Making us look like villains?" The crowd stirred. I felt my knees weaken. The old me, the one who begged, who apologized, nearly surfaced. But I forced her back into the grave where she belonged. "I am not ashamed," I said, my voice shaking but steady. Clara's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "No!" I cut her off, louder now. "How dare you? How dare you erase me? Feast at your tables while I sit alone. Pretend I don't exist." Gasps rippled through the room. My heart pounded, but I didn't stop. "I gave you everything, my body, my youth, my health. I shielded you from your father's fists. I starved so you could eat. And when I had nothing left, you buried me alive. But hear me now." I lifted my chin, fire blazing through my words. "I will not vanish. I will not be erased. If you cannot bear to see me, look away, but I will not hide." For a heartbeat, silence choked the hall, and then applause. It began with Margaret, her hands clapping sharp and steady, then Ruth, then others, until the room thundered with it, the sound shaking the walls. My children froze, pale with rage. Clara's husband dragged her toward the door. Marcus muttered curses, storming out. Henry lingered, his eyes dark, his children staring at me wide-eyed. For a flicker of a moment, I thought he might speak, but he turned and left. The applause roared in my ears. My body trembled, but I stood tall. For the first time in decades, I wasn't begging for their approval. I wasn't pressing my face to the window of their lives. I was my own. But humiliation is a dangerous wound, and children who bury their mother alive do not forgive her for clawing her way out of the grave. That night, Margaret squeezed my hand as we walked home under the stars. "You've set yourself free," she whispered. And I believed her. But freedom always comes with a price. My son had tasted shame, and shame is a hunger that always demands revenge. After the fair, I thought maybe the storm had broken. For one shining night I stood in front of strangers and spoke the truth I had swallowed for decades. And the world clapped. The applause carried me home like a tide, steady and bright. But storms don't end just because you're tired. They rage until something breaks. The retaliation began quietly, like cracks in glass. A neighbor told me she overheard my son at the cafe, his voice low and furious, telling the mayor that I was unstable, that I was making things up, that I needed to be stopped before I dragged our family name through the mud any further. Days later, Margaret came to me, her eyes sharp as knives. "Clara went to the library board," she said. "She told them you're delusional, that your stories are lies. She's trying to smear you." And Henry didn't bother with whispers. He came to my door again. It was near midnight. The pounding shook the thin walls of my little room, jolting me out of restless sleep. My heart lurched back 30 years to Robert's fists slamming doors, the dread, the silence that always followed before the blow. I froze, breath shallow. Then came his voice, slurred and venomous. "Open up, old woman, my baby, my Henry." When I opened the door, he swayed on his feet, reeking of whiskey. His eyes burned with something that was not just rage, but shame, thick and poisonous. Behind him, in the car, I saw the pale faces of his children, my grandchildren, staring at me through the glass like frightened ghosts. "You ruined us," he shouted, jabbing a finger at me. "You tell strangers our business, and now they look at me like I'm trash, like I'm him." Him, his father, the man whose fists I had taken so Henry would never know the terror of a blow. "Henry," I whispered, my voice trembling but steady. "Go home, please." The children. "Don't you say their names," he roared, so close I could feel his spit on my cheek. "You're nothing to them, nothing." The car horn blared, his wife urging him to stop. He staggered back, spat at my feet, and stumbled away. I closed the door, shaking. My knees buckled, but I didn't collapse. Instead, I picked up a rag and bent down. Slowly, methodically, I wiped his spit from the floor. That was the last time I opened the door for him. But they weren't finished. 2 weeks later, another envelope slid beneath my door. Marcus's handwriting, precise and cold. Inside was a letter that read like a threat dressed in legal words. "You are forbidden from contacting us or our children. You are forbidden from speaking about private family matters in public. If you continue, we will pursue legal action. This is your final warning." Final warning, as though I were a criminal, as though my life, my bruises, my hunger, my survival belonged to them. I laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that scraped my throat raw. I fed the letter to the stove and watched the fire curl it into ash. But their rage did not cool. The library invited me to paint a mural. Roses again, always roses, clawing through stone, their blooms defiant against gray. I stood on a ladder, brush in hand, the smell of paint in the air, when the doors slammed open, and there they were, my 3 children, standing together like a storm. Marcus first, immaculate suit, jaw clenched, eyes hard as glass. Clara behind him, her lips pressed thin, her pearl necklace glinting like armor. Henry, fists trembling, his children dragged along like unwilling witnesses. The library fell silent. Students froze mid-step, books clutched to their chests. Marcus's voice cut the air like broken glass. "What do you think you're doing? Spreading lies about us in public buildings? Humiliating your own family?" I climbed down from the ladder, brush still in my hand like a weapon. My knees shook, but I stood firm. "I'm painting," I said evenly. "I'm telling my story, that's all." "That's not your story," Clara hissed, trembling with fury. "That's ours, and you don't have permission to share it." Permission. The word struck me like a fist, as if my pain belonged to them, as if my hunger, my bruises, my survival required their blessing. "This is my life," I said, louder now, my voice rising. "I carried you in my body. I bled for you. I stood between you and your father's fists. And now you tell me I need permission to speak? No, no more." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. The air buzzed. Henry stepped forward, his face red, his voice shaking. "You ruined me. You ruined my marriage. You told my wife I was just like him." I looked at him, my baby, my winter child, the boy who once clung to me in storms, begging me to keep the monsters away. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "I didn't ruin you, Henry. He did. And now you're finishing his work." For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, pain, the truth clawing its way in. His children stared at me, wide-eyed, seeing not the monster their parents had painted me to be, but a woman standing tall against the storm. But then the rage returned. He lunged, fists clenched. Marcus caught his arm, hissing, "Not here." Clara turned on her heel and stormed out, pale with fury. Marcus dragged Henry with him, their children trailing like shadows. The library buzzed with whispers. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the brush. And then I felt a hand on my arm, Margaret. Her red scarf blazed like a banner. "You see," she whispered, "they can scream, but you're still standing. That's the difference." And she was right. But humiliation is a poison, and they had drunk it deep. The very next morning, I found my apartment door defaced. Red paint, fresh and dripping, smeared across the wood. The letters were so large I could smell the chemicals before I saw them. Liar, fraud, selfish. Neighbors peeked from their windows, whispering. I stood there, the stench burning my throat, the words bleeding into the cracks like a wound. For a moment, the old me almost returned. The woman who would have collapsed, who would have begged forgiveness just to make the shame stop. But I didn't collapse. I picked up a rag and began to scrub. The paint didn't all come off. The stains sank deep, a scar on the wood. And I left them there. Because here's what my children never understood. Every attempt to bury me gave me another reason to rise. Every word meant to silence me became fuel for the fire burning in my bones. They thought they had taken everything, my house, my family, my dignity. But they didn't realize I was already burning, and fire only grows when you feed it. After the red paint, I thought perhaps the storm had reached its peak. Surely, I told myself, there was nothing more they could do to wound me. But storms do not stop because you wish them away. They rage until they tear something down. A month later, the invitation came. The town hall was hosting a larger exhibition, and they wanted my roses included, not just one or two pieces, an entire wall. At first I hesitated. My children were watching, waiting, sharpening their knives. But then I touched the canvases stacked against my wall, roses clawing through cracks, women scarred but unbroken, storms splitting the sky. These were not hobbies. These were my voice, my proof. And I swore to myself I would never silence that voice again, so I said yes. The night of the exhibition, the hall glittered with light. People moved slowly from painting to painting, their whispers soft, reverent. Strangers, real strangers, who owed me nothing, stood still before my roses, some with tears in their eyes, some smiling as though they recognized themselves in the blooms. I stood at the edge of the crowd, trembling, not with fear, but with awe. For the first time in decades, I was not Marcus's mother, not Clara's embarrassment, not Henry's burden. I was an artist, a woman, alive. And then the doors opened, all three of them. Marcus, suit pressed to perfection, his expression stone. Clara, pearls glinting at her throat, her face painted with fury. Henry, fists clenched, dragging his children behind him like reluctant soldiers. The room shifted. Whispers rippled across the crowd. The applause that had filled my ears minutes earlier died into a tense silence. They walked toward me as one, a tribunal carved from flesh and rage. Marcus spoke first. His voice was sharp, polished like glass. "You think this makes you alive? All it makes you is pathetic." Clara's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. "You've embarrassed us for the last time." Henry spat his words like venom. "You should have stayed buried." Fear gripped me, the old kind, the kind that once made me cower in corners, swallow my screams, patch the wounds in silence. For a moment, I was back in the kitchen, Robert's shadow filling the doorway. For a moment, I felt small again, but then I looked up. I saw the roses on the walls, roses clawing through stone, blooming despite everything. I saw the faces in the crowd, strangers who had whispered beautiful. I saw Margaret in the corner, her red scarf blazing, her eyes daring me to stand. And I remembered every bruise I had hidden, every hunger I had swallowed, every silent scream I had pressed into pillows so my children wouldn't hear. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and spoke. "You pretended I was dead," I said, my voice carrying across the hall. "But I lived. You erased me, but I wrote myself back. You wanted me silent, but I will not vanish, not now, not ever." The words rang out like bells. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For one heartbeat, silence pressed heavy, and then applause. It began with one woman, then another, until the entire hall thundered with clapping, voices rising like a wave. My children froze, their faces pale with shock. Clara's husband tugged at her arm, dragging her toward the exit as she spat curses through her teeth. Marcus muttered under his breath, fury twisting his features before storming out. Henry lingered his children staring at me with wide eyes. For the briefest flicker, I saw something in him. Hesitation, fear, maybe even shame. But he dropped his head and left without a word. The applause roared in my ears. My knees trembled, but I stood rooted, unbroken. For the first time, I wasn't begging for their approval. I wasn't pressing my face against the glass of their world, praying to be let in. I was standing in mine. But humiliation does not fade. It festers. Clara began spinning stories, telling anyone who would listen that I was sick in the head, that I was addicted to pity, that I invented tragedies to keep the spotlight on myself. She poured my pain into gossip glasses and let her friends drink it with their wine. Marcus used his connections like weapons. Whispers started to circulate in the paper that I was senile, that my paintings were nothing but desperate cries for attention, that my children were the true victims of a delusional mother. His lies dripped like poison, clean and convincing. And Henry left me messages in the night, calls filled with liquor and rage, notes shoved under my door. Enough, stop, last warning. But I had been warned my whole life. Be quiet, be small, endure, survive. And I was done listening. I poured everything into the canvas. Roses grew sharper, their thorns curling like claws. Storms ripped skies apart. Women stood with eyes blazing like fire, their scars glowing like metals, and people noticed. The cafe owner asked to hang my work on his walls. The library mural became a gathering place. Mothers and daughters standing in front of it, whispering, some with tears, some with fists clenched in defiance. A gallery in the city invited me to show a full collection. For the first time in 70 years, people said my name not as a burden, not as an afterthought, but with respect, with recognition. My son never came to see any of it, not the cafe, not the mural, not the gallery. He stayed in his silence except for the venom he hurled from the shadows. But I stopped waiting for him. I stopped chasing his love like a starving dog chasing scraps, because I had built something stronger. Family is not always blood. Family is whoever refuses to forget you. Family is whoever sees you when the world calls you invisible. Margaret became my sister. The women in the circle became my daughters, and the neighborhood children who painted beside me, their laughter filling my walls, became my grandchildren. I was 68. My knees ached when I stood too long. My hands trembled when I painted until dawn. My breath caught when I climbed stairs. But I was alive, alive in a way I had never been when I lived only for him. And I began to understand. My son could take my house, but he could not take me. Yet I also knew this war was not over. He had declared me dead once, and now, seeing me rise again, he would try to make that lie real. I thought the city gallery would be my triumph. Rows of canvases lined in light, strangers walking slowly, whispering reverently before my roses, my storms, my women with unbroken eyes, my name printed on the wall in clean black letters, my name. For one shining night, I believed I had carved myself back into the world. But humiliation festers, and my children had been humiliated in front of neighbors, colleagues, friends. They had lost control, and children who bury their mother alive do not forgive her for clawing her way out of the grave. The threats grew bolder. Clara's gossip turned venomous. She told wealthy friends that I had memory problems, that I was confusing fantasy for truth. Marcus leaned on reporters, planting questions sharp as knives. Did your children really abandon you? Did you exaggerate your husband's violence? Some say you're chasing attention. And Henry filled my nights with liquor-soaked calls, growls of "stop" before something happens. But here's what they didn't understand. I had already died once. Fear had lost its teeth. Still, I knew something was coming. I could feel it like thunder rolling across the horizon. It broke the night of the gallery opening. I stood by my roses, shaking hands pressed together, strangers congratulating me, thanking me, telling me my art looked like their mother's eyes, their grandmother's scars. And then the doors slammed open. My son entered, my only son, and behind him Marcus and Clara followed, faces hard, shoulders squared, united in fury. The crowd stilled, whispers rising like smoke. He strode to the center of the room, his voice loud enough to shatter the air. This woman is a liar. She's not a victim. She's an old fool inventing stories to make herself look noble. Don't believe her paintings. Don't believe her words. She is nothing but shame. Gasps rippled. Some people stepped back. Others stared at me, waiting. And for a flicker of a second, I felt the old fear return. My breath caught. My knees trembled. I almost shrank. Almost. But then I looked at my canvases, the roses clawing through stone, the women with fire in their eyes. They weren't just paintings. They were me, my proof. I turned to the crowd. My voice shook at first, but steadied as it rose. Yes, I am old. Yes, I have scars. I have been beaten, starved, abandoned. I signed away my house because I believed in my son more than I believed in myself. And he took it. He took everything. The room went still, the words heavy in the air. But here is what he could not take. My voice, my fire, my will to stand. My son's face flushed, his jaw trembling with rage. You're pathetic. No. My voice cut through his like a blade. I am not pathetic. I am proof. Proof that you can be erased and still return. Proof that you can be buried alive and still claw your way back to the light. I turned to the crowd, my chest burning. You see, dignity is not given, it is claimed, and tonight I claim mine. The applause came like a wave, first a trickle, then a roar, louder than any silence I had ever endured, louder than his threats, than his curses, than the slammed doors of my past. My son froze, pale with fury. Clara dragged Marcus toward the exit, hissing. Henry lingered, his children staring at me with wide eyes. For the briefest flicker, I saw something crack inside him, hesitation, maybe shame. But he lowered his head and followed the others, and I stood, trembling but tall, as the crowd clapped. That was the night I understood the truth. My son had stolen my house. But I had taken something far greater in return. I had taken back my dignity. Because houses crumble, families betray. But dignity, once you claim it, is untouchable. Now I am 68. My body aches when I wake. My breath shortens on long walks. My hands tremble when I paint into the night. But I am alive. in a way I never was when I lived only for them. I am not waiting for their forgiveness. I am not begging for scraps of love. I am building a table of my own with women who see me, with children who are not my blood, but call me family, with strangers who stand before my roses and whisper beautiful. And if you are listening, if you too have been erased, abandoned, discarded, hear me. If your children pretend you are dead, live anyway. If they take your house, build yourself a kingdom of fire. If they bury you alive, claw back out screaming, because you are more than their silence. You are more than their shame. You are more than what they stole. My son took my house, but I found a way to take back my dignity. And this time, this life is mine.